In the records of Joseon, Korea, there are scattered references that raise difficult questions. Some court documents describe kings who kept close male attendants by their side. Certain poems and diaries hint at affections between scholars that went beyond ordinary friendship. Folk stories, too, sometimes mention same-sex bonds as part of hidden village life. But how should we read these traces today? Were they coded language for intimacy or simply exaggerated loyalty written in flowery style? Did these fragments reflect real practices that later Confucian morality tried to silence, or are we only projecting modern ideas onto the past? The evidence is incomplete, leaving only hints and uncertainties. Do these traces suggest that same-sex love existed more openly in Joseon, Korea? Or is that just our interpretation now? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to drop the time you're watching. Subscribing is always your choice, but the next stories may challenge your view of history even more. They tell you Joseon, Korea was built like a stage play, where every actor had to wear the same mask, and the mask was called Neo-Confucian virtue. You stand in the middle of a capital city, where rooftops gleam with tiles, where the palace gates clang shut each evening, and you feel the weight of rules that govern not just how you bow, but even how you breathe. The scholars say, family hierarchy is sacred. The 5 relationships must remain unbroken, and desire should flow only in its proper channels. But you wonder what happens when those rules meet the messy, unpredictable reality of human attraction. You look around the court and the markets and see men walking shoulder to shoulder, women sitting together to embroider, students sharing cramped study rooms. In a world that prizes uniformity, could there have been spaces where intimacy crossed the lines, drawn by Confucian ink? Neo-Confucian texts preached chastity and propriety. But do we trust every verse to have been obeyed, especially when written by men whose job was to sound stricter than they lived? Picture yourself reading the Gyeongguk Daejeon, the great law code, with its endless lines about punishment for improper acts. The punishment sounds severe, yet the very existence of those laws suggests that such acts were happening often enough to require mention. If everyone followed the script perfectly, why would the state bother with entire paragraphs about what not to do? Isn't that like finding a modern school handbook with a rule against skateboarding in hallways? You immediately picture someone rolling past the lockers, don't you? You hear echoes from Ming China, where Joseon borrowed its Confucian backbone. The Chinese elite had stories of emperors with male companions of poets who wrote verses to their male lovers, all carefully cloaked in metaphors about wind and moonlight. If Joseon imported the books, the philosophy, and even the dress codes, could it also have inherited these quieter traditions of same-sex closeness? Or did the local scholars try harder to erase them, fearing contamination of their perfectly polished image? In the official records, scribes rarely mention desire between men or between women. Yet silence itself raises questions. Was it silence of absence or silence of suppression? Imagine a teacher erasing certain answers from the blackboard. Before class begins, the lesson looks tidy, but you can still see the faint chalk dust if you lean close. Could the annals of Joseon be hiding those same smudges? Even Confucian family life was full of contradictions. Men were told to marry produce heirs and remain faithful to lineage, yet wealthy Yangban often kept concubines, and kings themselves rotated through entire palaces of women. If bending the rules was common in one direction, might people have bent them in other directions too? Could palace maids have sought comfort in one another's arms on long nights of isolation? Could scholars studying for years in sequestered exam halls have formed bonds that slipped beyond friendship? You recall how Confucian ideals emphasize the balance of yin and yang, male and female. But what if two forces of the same kind met and found their own balance? Would that be condemned as disharmony or quietly tolerated as long as no one spoke too loudly about it? Some records hint that the language of yin-yang could stretch like a rubber band, able to accommodate metaphors beyond strict gender pairing. Are these hints deliberate, or are we reading too much between the lines centuries later? Consider also the tension between appearance and reality. Officials paraded their virtue in public, yet gossip often whispered the opposite in private courtyards. Think of how in modern workplaces everyone praises teamwork in meetings, while in private chats people confess who they can't stand. Could Joseon society have run the same way, where outwardly everyone praised moral order, but privately relationships bloomed in ways the law pretended did not exist? You even wonder about the art of the period. Paintings showed scenes of scholars meeting under pavilions of friends strolling through gardens. Their gazes sometimes seem to linger, their sleeves brush against each other just a little too casually. Is this just your modern imagination projecting romance onto ink strokes? Or did the artist quietly embed a truth the censors could overlook? And then there is the paradox of repression. The harder a society tries to press down on certain desires, the more those desires invent new hiding places. If Joseon was indeed as rigid as the textbooks claim would that not create fertile soil for secret coded expressions of intimacy? Like water finding cracks in stone, could attraction have seeped into corners the law could never fully seal? You stand again at the palace gates, hearing the clang of order, the chant of scholars, the rhythm of ritual bows. And beneath it all, you wonder if another rhythm was pulsing, one of whispers, glances, and hidden verses, too faint to be recorded, yet strong enough to survive in rumor. Was Joseon Korea truly a flawless temple of Confucian virtue? Or was it more like a stage with trap doors beneath the polished floor? You slip into the shadows of the royal court, where gossip floats like incense and vanishes as soon as you try to catch it. Kings in Joseon Korea were meant to embody Confucian virtue, but monarchs were also human, and human hearts are stubborn things. What do you make of the rumors that some kings held unusual affection for certain male attendants? Court diaries mention attendants who never left the king's side favored with gifts, promoted beyond expectation. Could those bonds have been purely political, or did they carry undertones of something more personal? You think of King Gongmin in the late Goryeo era, just before the rise of Joseon. Chroniclers wrote that he surrounded himself with handsome male companions after his queen died, causing ministers to wring their hands in moral panic. The Joseon dynasty styled itself as a stricter, more righteous kingdom, but would human nature have changed overnight when the dynasty changed? Or did those patterns continue in subtler forms, hidden behind stricter masks? When you imagine life inside Gyeongbokgung Palace, it feels almost claustrophobic. Eunuchs managed the king's daily affairs, officials hovered, and court ladies filled the living quarters. But among that sea of servants, a few male favorites often stood out. Records sometimes describe them as witty, beautiful, or unusually close to the monarch. Why else would whispers spread unless courtiers suspected more than friendship? If no one ever thought twice, would scribes bother to note it? The annals of the Joseon dynasty, that massive chronicle stretching across centuries, contains passages where officials criticized a king's indulgence in improper company. Yet those words are vague. What kind of company exactly? They might have meant indulgence in alcohol or indulgence in entertainment, but could they also have been veiled references to relationships officials dared not name? Outright, you can't help but sense layers of meaning buried under bureaucratic phrasing. Royal succession politics made intimacy even more dangerous. Imagine if a king showed too much favor to a male attendant. Would ministers worry that influence might outweigh that of the queen or crown prince? Rumors of unusual closeness could be weaponized not only to shame a king, but also to undermine his allies. Do you see how a whisper in the court might become as sharp as any sword on the battlefield? Think also of the cultural imports from China. Ming emperors were rumored to have had male favorites. Stories about them circulated in Korea too. Could Joseon officials have looked nervously over their shoulders, fearing the same accusations might taint their own kings? If a Chinese emperor's intimacy with men was whispered about, wouldn't courtiers in Seoul be quick to suspect similar patterns at home? You try to picture the dynamic: a young king isolated by power, surrounded by ministers who constantly lecture him on virtue. To whom could he turn for comfort? A loyal attendant who laughs at his jokes, who brings him late-night tea, who listens without judgment. Could such companionship, repeated night after night, have crossed boundaries of simple duty? Or is that just the romantic imagination of later storytellers layering color onto otherwise plain records? Royal poetry adds another layer of intrigue. Some kings wrote verses about the beauty of close companions, though scholars debate whether these were meant to be read literally or metaphorically. Isn't it striking, though, how often poets use ambiguity to hide what cannot be said openly? Could a line about the moon reflecting in a pond really be about the gaze of a beloved servant? Could metaphors be serving as camouflage for feelings too dangerous to state? The question remains, did these whispers reflect reality, or were they merely tools of slander? In a rigid Confucian court, accusing someone of immoral intimacy was a powerful weapon. If you wanted to topple a rival, hinting that his relationship with the king was improper could destroy his reputation. Do the records we read today preserve genuine fragments of hidden lives, or do they simply echo the politics of smear campaigns? Standing in the palace courtyard, you feel the strange pull of these silences and insinuations. You can almost hear the hushed voices of ministers debating in closed chambers, weighing whether to accuse the king outright or let rumors smolder. You cannot know for sure, but the question lingers in a world that prized moral perfection. Was affection between kings and their favorites? A dangerous secret that dared not speak its name. You wander now from the palace into the quiet study halls of the Yangban elite, where brush and ink were supposed to serve only the Confucian classics. Yet on the margins of those books, poets sometimes scribbled verses that feel strangely tender, strangely personal. Could it be that homoerotic poems slipped like contraband into the respectable world of scholarship? Or are we simply imagining intimacy where there was only flowery metaphor? In the Joseon world, poetry was more than art. It was a way to bond, to signal refinement, to impress friends. You picture a gathering of young scholars beneath lantern light, passing cups of rice wine, trading lines of verse about moonlight glinting on mountains, or rivers flowing side by side. One poem speaks of two willows bending toward each other in the wind. Is it just a harmless image of nature or a coded expression of affection between the poet and his friend? Some anthologies survive with poems dedicated to particular companions praising their beauty. their jade-like skin, or their red lips. You pause. Are those just stock metaphors borrowed from Chinese poetry, or could they have carried a deeper, riskier meaning in the Korean context? Scholars debate whether such verses were meant to be read as playful exaggerations, or whether they were whispers of love that dared not name itself. What do you think? Were these poets being coy or courageous? Confucian decorum demanded that men speak of loyalty, friendship, and virtue. But sometimes those words stretch thin, almost transparent, revealing feelings beyond friendship. Isn't it telling how easily the language of camaraderie can blur into the language of desire? You might compare it to how in today's world people send inside jokes or emojis that mean one thing to outsiders, but something much more charged to those in the know. Could Joseon poetry have functioned in the same way, hiding desire in plain sight? One famous example often mentioned is Unseondo, the celebrated poet. His verses to younger male pupils sparkle with admiration for their beauty and talents. Were those lines simply the conventional praise of a mentor, or did they hint at something warmer? If we can't say for sure, then isn't the ambiguity itself worth noticing? Why would so many poems risk language that could be misread, unless the poets were dancing deliberately on the edge of interpretation? The Chinese literary influence loomed large here too. Many Chinese poets had openly celebrated love between men in earlier dynasties, and their books circulated in Joseon. Did Korean scholars read those verses as mere foreign curiosities? Or did they find themselves quietly moved by them? You imagine a scholar carefully copying out a Chinese poem about a male lover, hiding it between his Confucian notes, heart racing, not because of exam anxiety, but because he recognized himself in the words. Of course, the safest camouflage for risky feelings was to embed them in allegory. Rivers yearning to meet birds flying in pairs, spring blossoms fading too soon. These are all images that can pass as innocent nature poetry. But don't you think they could also serve as secret diaries, each line carrying two meanings? For the censor, harmless. For the companion who receives it, unforgettable. And what of those poetry exchanges passed like folded notes between students in academies? Imagine sitting in a cold dormitory candle, flickering low, opening a slip of paper that praises your eyes as clearer than autumn skies. Do you laugh and chalk it up to literary practice, or do you read it again, cheeks warming, wondering if your friend has just confessed something daring? Even modern readers cannot agree. Some literary critics insist we must not project modern categories of identity onto pre-modern poetry. Yet others argue the intensity of these verses cannot be dismissed as mere friendship. Which side is right? Perhaps the truth lies in the tension itself, in the fact that the poems keep us guessing, just as they may have kept their original readers guessing too. You tuck away one of those verses in your sleeve, feeling its weight like a secret pressed against your skin. You don't know if it is love, admiration, or simply a game of words, but the uncertainty makes it more alive. Isn't history often like this, a puzzle where the missing pieces invite as many questions as the ones that remain? What if I told you the barracks of Joseon soldiers held more stories than the battlefield ever revealed? Picture rows of men sleeping on straw mats, sharing blankets in the bitter cold, drilling together at dawn, eating from the same pot. In such cramped, relentless closeness, is it any wonder that bonds grew deeper than camaraderie? And if so, how far might those bonds have gone? Military life in Joseon was harsh. Soldiers were often conscripted peasants forced to abandon farms and families to guard remote forts or patrol the borders. Loneliness was a given. When weeks turned into months, then years, who became your family? The man standing beside you at the wall, the one who shared his last bowl of rice, the one who watched your back when arrows rained down. Could affection, forged in such conditions, have blurred into intimacy? You imagine the long stretches without women present frontier. Garrisons in the north coastal fortresses battered by salt wind mountain strongholds buried in snow. In those spaces, soldiers lived cheek by jowl, bathing in rivers together, singing around fires. Ancient armies from Greece to Japan left records of same-sex bonds among soldiers. Why should Joseon's armies have been entirely different? Doesn't human need for closeness persist no matter what uniform you wear? The records are of course cautious. Manuals speak of discipline, loyalty, and the brotherhood of arms. Yet isn't it striking how many ballads and folk songs emphasize brotherhood in ways that sound almost romantic? One old tale tells of two soldiers who pledged never to part swearing under a full moon. Was that merely symbolic loyalty, or was it echoing something more personal, a vow of hearts as well as swords? Think of how easily camaraderie can disguise deeper feelings. Even today, teammates on a sports squad may joke hug or share secrets that outsiders misinterpret or perhaps fail to interpret at all. Could Joseon's military bonds have followed a similar script, blending practical dependence with layers of affection that only the participants understood? And then there is the evidence from punishment records. Scattered references accuse soldiers of indecent acts with their comrades. The language is vague intentionally so, but the fact that such cases exist suggests possibilities. Were these isolated scandals, or hints of a wider pattern carefully kept out of official sight? If authorities punished only when things became too obvious, what might have happened quietly unnoticed in the shadows of tents? You step into one of those barracks in your imagination. The air smells of sweat leather and wood smoke. A soldier sharpens his blade by lamplight, while another hums an old folk tune. They laugh, nudge shoulders, share a bowl of hot soup. In that fragile moment, you wonder, was their closeness purely brotherly, or did it carry an undercurrent that would never be written into the annals? Historical parallels tempt you. Samurai in Japan left poems about beloved companions in arms. Greek hoplites formed pairs said to fight more fiercely side by side. Should we believe Joseon soldiers, bound by the same dangers of war and isolation, were entirely immune to the same impulses? Or do we simply want to find patterns because they make the past feel familiar? The most intriguing question may not be what happened, but what could not be spoken. Military men swore loyalty to king and country, but could they also have whispered loyalty to one another, loyalty of a different kind? Imagine hearing two soldiers promise to return alive for each other's sake, words heavier than duty alone. Would you hear only comradeship, or would you sense something more? So you march with them, boots sinking into mud breath, clouding in the winter air. Their songs echo over the valleys, cheerful on the surface, but carrying undertones you cannot quite decipher. And once again, you ask, were Joseon's barracks only the breeding ground of discipline, or were they also the hidden cradle of forbidden tenderness? You slip now into the flickering glow of taverns and private chambers, where Kizeng entertained the elite. They were expected to charm men with music, poetry, and wit. But here's the twist. What about when the candlelight revealed affections not aimed at their patrons but at each other. Could these women bound to lives of performance have also found solace in one another's company? When the men went home, Kiseng were trained from girlhood to dance, recite poetry, and play instruments. They lived together in government-managed houses, a system that sounds oddly like a boarding school mixed with a guild. Doesn't close training long. Rehearsals and shared quarters create the conditions where bonds beyond simple friendship might emerge. If you imagine a room of young women practicing lute melodies late into the night, giggling under blankets, whispering secrets, would it be so surprising if intimacy developed between them? Some surviving anecdotes hint that Kiseng sometimes formed pairings, praised for their beauty together, or mocked for being inseparable. One tale describes two performers who refused to be parted even when their patrons demanded otherwise. Was this simply loyalty between friends, or was it evidence of something deeper, a relationship that dared to bloom under watchful eyes? The stories never quite say, but the gaps leave you wondering. Patrons themselves occasionally recorded odd remarks. One scholar's diary mentions jealousy when two Kiseng seemed too absorbed in each other's conversation. Another described watching women exchange sly glances while pouring wine. Are these just details of playful performance, or did observers sense something they dared not spell out? Isn't it curious how often suspicion enters when bonds fall outside expected patterns? The role of gender expectations complicates things further. Confucian society assumed women existed to serve men, yet within Kiseng circles, women taught, disciplined, and supported each other. Could their community have become a space where affection escaped male control? Like a hidden garden behind high walls, might their relationships have blossomed in ways officials chose to ignore? Think about how performance itself offered cover. When two Kiseng embraced during a dance, the audience might laugh at the novelty. But what if the performers themselves infused it with genuine affection? In a society where women's voices were suppressed, could art provide the perfect mask for forbidden feelings? Isn't that the clever trick of performance, that it tells truths while pretending to be only play? Of course, historians hesitate. They remind us that most records were written by men, often filtering female lives through desire or suspicion. If we see hints of intimacy among Kiseng, are we glimpsing reality or only peering through a male narrator's distorted lens? Yet doesn't the very unease in those records suggest something unsettled, something that challenged the expected order? You picture two Kiseng walking back from an evening's performance, lantern swinging between them. Their sleeves brush. They laugh quietly. One steadies the other across a patch of uneven stones. A passerby might see nothing unusual, but what if those small gestures carried meanings only they understood? Haven't you seen moments like that in your own life? Tiny exchanges that outsiders miss, but insiders treasure. And then there is the question of survival. Kiseng were vulnerable, often powerless before patrons and officials. Could deep bonds with each other have served not only as comfort, but as strategies of resistance? If you know someone loves you beyond mere friendship, doesn't that give you strength to endure the demands of those who hold power over you? As you sit in that candlelit room, hearing music fade into the night, you wonder again, were these women simply artists performing roles for men? Or were they also authors of secret stories scribbled in the spaces between the songs? The records remain vague, the verses ambiguous, the glances unrecorded. But don't the silences themselves seem almost loud? You leave the world of palaces and kisang houses and step into the night markets where commoners hustle for scraps of silver and life is lived closer to the bone. Here the glow of lanterns flickers over stalls of fried cakes, medicine peddlers, and fortune tellers. The streets smell of smoke sweat and boiled rice. Beneath the noise of bargaining, could there also have been spaces where same-sex desire slipped into view, fleeting and fragile? The Yangban elites left their polished records, but the voices of commoners rarely appear. When they do, they come in songs, rumors, or court cases. One case mentions two young men accused of indecency in a public bathhouse. The punishment was more a slap on the wrist than a full condemnation. Does this suggest the act was unusual, or that it was common enough to be treated as a minor nuisance? Could bathhouses with their crowded steam and slippery privacy have been quiet meeting grounds for encounters the state preferred not to name? You picture back alleys where traveling actors, shamans, and drummers gathered. Performers lived on the margins, often distrusted, often mocked. Yet marginal spaces sometimes allow more freedom. Could these communities have nurtured relationships that Confucian officials ignored as long as they stayed outside respectable walls? Isn't it often true that what's forbidden at the center thrives at the edges? Folk songs hint at bonds that don't fit neatly into Confucian categories. A verse about a man missing his friend's embrace, another about women who swore never to part. Are these simply metaphors for loyalty, or echoes of real relationships that commoners felt too dangerous to record in plain speech? When ordinary people sang such songs at festivals, were they joking or confessing through rhyme what they couldn't say aloud? Street plays sometimes mocked officials by showing men disguised as women dancing and flirting with each other to laughter. On the surface, it was comedy. But could those scenes also have reflected realities audiences recognized, even if they laughed to cover discomfort? Just as modern stand-up comedians slip truths inside jokes, might Joseon performers have staged subversive glimpses of desire that officials dismissed as harmless theater? Consider, too, the way people carved out privacy in cramped neighborhoods. Courtyards, shared wells, and small rooms made secrecy difficult. Yet the very closeness might have created moments when bonds went unnoticed. Imagine two women tasked with weaving mats together, leaning close to share gossip, or two apprentices sleeping in the same loft above a shop whispering into the dark. Did anyone pay attention, or was survival so consuming that private affections past unremarked legal records show inconsistencies? Some cases of improper acts were prosecuted harshly, others barely mentioned. Could it be that authorities cared only when such relationships disrupted property or family order? If no inheritance was threatened, if no marriage contract was broken, did people sometimes look the other way? Doesn't that raise the possibility of a hidden world where desire quietly persisted, invisible to the official gaze? And what about the shamans who moved between villages, often women commanding respect through ritual? Their ceremonies sometimes involved ecstatic dances, spirit possessions, and intimacy with assistants. Did those moments blur into expressions of affection between women shielded by the language of ritual? Or are we simply reading into gestures that meant something entirely different to the participants? Walking through that bustling market, you hear laughter spilling from taverns. You catch glimpses of hands brushing too long, eyes lingering across the crowd. Are you simply projecting your own modern expectations? Or are you catching the same fleeting signals that neighbors might also have noticed centuries ago? Isn't history often a matter of deciding how much weight to give to those passing glances? You pause by a food stall, tasting the heat of spicy broth. Around you, strangers jostle the night hums, and hidden lives stir beneath the noise. Were the streets of Joseon just places of commerce, or did they also serve as corridors where forbidden tenderness slipped past unnoticed? The question hangs in the smoke, unanswered, yet strangely persistent. What if the sharpest chill in Joseon didn't come from winter winds, but from the gaze of Confucian scholars determined to police desire? Imagine a world where ministers carried not only law books, but also moral yardsticks ready to measure your life against their narrow ideals. When edicts thundered about unnatural behavior, were they protecting society or desperately trying to silence something they feared was already too common? Neo-Confucian ideology prized order above all. The family was the cornerstone reproduction, the duty lineage, the sacred chain. Anything that did not fit into that frame was branded suspicious. You can hear the tone of official memorials, vague warnings about improper acts, anxious comparisons to the corruption of foreign dynasties. But what drove this nervousness? If no one ever bent the rules, why bother warning so often? Isn't the loudest preaching usually aimed at temptations already present? Court records describe officials accusing others of moral failings as a way to win political battles. A minister whispers that his rival spends too much time with certain attendants. Another claims an enemy is corrupting the youth. Do these accusations reflect real behavior, or are they smokescreens of slander? Either way, don't they show how easily intimations of same-sex intimacy could be weaponized, whether true or not? Sometimes the punishments were severe: banishment, flogging, disgrace. Yet other times the language remained deliberately vague, the case quietly dropped. Could this inconsistency reveal that enforcement depended less on morality and more on politics? If you were useful to the king, perhaps whispers were ignored. If you had enemies, the same whispers could end your career. Doesn't that suggest the crackdowns were as much about control as about virtue? The scholars themselves seemed haunted by contradictions. They condemned deviance, yet they preserved Chinese texts filled with homoerotic imagery in their libraries. They praised loyalty between friends as the highest virtue, yet trembled when that loyalty looked too passionate. Is it possible they feared desire, not because it was rare, but because it blurred the tidy lines they clung to? Imagine walking through a Confucian academy. Young men study side by side for years, isolated from women bound to discipline. The instructors thunder about propriety. But do you sense the irony? The stricter the rules, the more energy must have gone into finding ways around them. Doesn't repression breed creativity in codes and poetry, in glances that linger when no one else is watching? You might compare it to modern internet censorship. The more the state blocks certain sites, the more people invent clever tricks to bypass them. Could Joseon's society have been the same? Each edict against improper acts may have pushed people to hide deeper, to invent subtler ways of expression. The crackdown itself may have been proof that desire refused to disappear. And then there are the silences in women's records. When female intimacy surfaced, it was dismissed as trivial, childish, or just play. Why so dismissive? Was it because officials truly believed nothing serious was happening? Or because they did not want to admit women could claim desire independent of men? Isn't it telling how the most powerful denials often hide the most stubborn truths? Standing at the edge of this moral theater, you feel the contradiction pressing in. The louder the proclamations about virtue, the more you suspect something else was simmering under the surface. Were Joseon's moral crackdowns a sign of strength or a confession of fear? Did they succeed in erasing forbidden desires, or did they only teach people to write them in subtler ink? You sit now in the quieter corners of Joseon society among women whose voices seldom reach the page. Diaries were rare letters, even rarer, and most official scribes didn't care to record the private bonds of women. Yet every so often, a faint trace appears an anecdote in folklore, a whisper in gossip, a fragment in a family memoir. And you wonder, do these scattered hints suggest women found intimacy with each other, only to have their stories buried beneath silence? Consider the way women's quarters were structured. Noble women lived secluded in inner chambers, sometimes going months without contact beyond their family. Servants, maids, and kiseng shared sleeping quarters, working and living together day and night. In those small enclosed spaces, what kinds of attachments formed? If men studying in academies could grow close, why would women confined together not experience the same? But if they did, how could such stories survive when men controlled the pen folk tales occasionally mention pairs of women described as unusually devoted, refusing to marry or mourning each other's deaths with striking passion? Are these tales exaggerated morality lessons or reflections of relationships that neighbors once whispered about? When a story praises two sisters who lived inseparably, should we take the word sisters literally, or as a safe label to cover something unspoken? You think of the few diaries left by noblewomen. Some wrote about missing companions, praising their beauty in language strikingly similar to male poetry about women. Was this simply the style of the time-borrowed metaphors with no hidden meaning? Or are we brushing off voices that dared to reveal what men preferred to ignore? Doesn't the ambiguity feel suspicious, as though the truth was hiding in plain sight? The problem of interpretation lingers. Modern readers may search hungrily for signs of same-sex intimacy, while historians warn against projecting categories backward. Yet even if we avoid labels, can we ignore the intensity of these bonds? If a woman writes she cannot sleep without her friend beside her, does it matter whether she meant love, desire, or deep companionship? Doesn't the very intensity demand we pause? Shamanism offers another path of speculation. Female shamans often worked in pairs, guiding each other through trance and ritual. Villagers described them as inseparable, bound by both spirit and daily life. Were these purely professional bonds, or did they sometimes carry a layer of affection unspoken but understood? When the drumming ended and the spirits departed, what quiet moments lingered? And think of the ridicule. Male officials sometimes mocked women for being childish when they clung to each other too much. Yet mockery itself betrays anxiety. Why laugh at something harmless? Could the jokes mask unease at behavior that didn't fit the neat picture of women waiting dutifully for husbands? Haven't you seen how society often dismisses what it doesn't want to understand? You picture two young women embroidering under lamplight, their heads bent close together. One laughs, the other reaches to tuck a stray hair back into place. A family member passing by sees nothing unusual, but what if those gestures carried a meaning too subtle for outsiders to notice? Isn't history full of such unrecorded moments, hidden in gestures too small for scribes to bother with? The absence of evidence does not mean absence of experience. It may only mean absence of permission. Women's voices were not considered worthy of record, and so their bonds vanish from official pages. But you wonder, if we could lift the paper walls of those chambers, would we find stories as rich, as complicated, and as forbidden as those whispered about men? Or do we only have silence because silence was the safest mask? You step forward in time into the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when the shadow of colonialism fell across Korea. The Japanese Empire arrived not only with soldiers and bureaucrats, but also with pens eager to rewrite history. And you ask yourself, what happens to stories of same-sex intimacy when new rulers decide what counts as civilized and what must be erased? Colonial officials brought their own moral codes shaped by Western ideas of sexuality imported through Japan. They looked back at Joseon's past and labeled practices as backward or deviant, fitting them neatly into categories of shame. But were those labels describing reality, or were they colonial tools designed to control how Koreans saw themselves? Isn't it suspicious how often conquerors reshape the past to justify their rule? Missionaries played their part too. They translated old records with eyes trained by Christian morality, often exaggerating sin, where earlier scribes had been deliberately vague. Could whispers of companionship between men or women have been twisted into scandal to prove that Korea needed saving? Or were some details dismissed entirely buried under layers of selective translation? How much of what we read today reflects Joseon itself, and how much reflects colonial agendas? Think also about the rise of modern medicine and psychology under Japanese rule. Suddenly, desires that had once been described in metaphors or accusations were cataloged in clinical language. Scholars began classifying people as normal or abnormal, importing ideas of pathology. Did this new vocabulary erase the fluid ambiguities of earlier centuries? Could a poem about a beloved companion survive when the very concept of companionship was being dissected into medical categories? Some colonial ethnographies exoticized the past. They claimed Koreans once tolerated strange practices, but quickly added that modernization had cleansed them. Were these scholars uncovering truths or inventing a contrast to showcase their own supposed progress? When you read their words, now can you ever be sure whether you are glimpsing Joseon reality or colonial propaganda? Consider the power of omission. If Japanese compilers left out evidence of same-sex intimacy, either by accident or design, then later generations inherited silence instead of memory. How many traces disappeared, not because they never existed, but because someone decided not to copy them into the new archives? Isn't the greatest trick of colonial power its ability to make people forget what was once obvious? Yet paradoxically, colonialism also preserved certain fragments. Missionaries curious or scandalized sometimes wrote down stories locals themselves might have ignored. Folklore collections mention unusual friendships, translated with judgmental tones. Are those biased glimpses nonetheless better than nothing? Or do they distort reality so thoroughly that they mislead more than they reveal? You imagine a Joseon-era poem about two scholars tucked away in an archive later read by a Japanese censor. Does he note it as mere literature or underline it as evidence of decadence? Does he translate it faithfully or adjust the phrasing to make it sound more scandalous? And centuries later, when you encounter that version, do you see Joseon's voice or only the censor's shadow? Standing in that in-between moment, you feel history bend under pressure. Colonialism did not just conquer land. It conquered memory, rearranging which stories survived and how they were told. So when we ask about homosexuality in Joseon, Korea, are we asking about Joseon itself? Or about the layers of distortion laid over it by outsiders with their own agendas? What if the past never really disappears, but lingers like a faint echo you can still hear if you listen closely? In today's Korea debates about identity and tradition, often circle back to history, and somewhere in that conversation, the whispers of Joseon still flicker. Were those old poems, rumors, and silences truly empty? Or do they continue shaping how people imagine themselves now? You notice how literature classes occasionally stumble across ambiguous verses from the Joseon era. Professors ask, is this friendship or something more? Students laugh nervously, unsure how to answer. Doesn't that hesitation prove the questions still matter? A poem written 5 centuries ago still has the power to unsettle, to make people squirm, to suggest that history may not be as tidy as the textbooks claim. Modern writers sometimes revive these fragments. Novels and dramas hint at secret relationships in the court, suggesting that behind the painted screens of palaces lived people as complicated as we are. Are these dramatizations accurate, or are they modern imaginations filling in gaps? Does it matter if the very act of imagining keeps those forgotten lives alive? You also see how activists point to history as evidence that Korea's past was not as uniform as once believed. They ask if whispers of intimacy existed in Joseon. Doesn't that challenge the idea that such desires are foreign imports? Could it be that they were always here, just hidden under Confucian silence and colonial erasure? The question itself stirs debate, reminding everyone how fragile collective memory can be. And then there's the tension between pride and discomfort. Some embrace the idea that Joseon's hidden loves prove continuity of human diversity. Others bristle, preferring to protect the myth of a pure, orderly past. Isn't it fascinating how the same scraps of evidence can provoke such opposite reactions? History never answers definitively, but it keeps the conversation alive. Think of how even silence shapes identity. When generations grow up told that such stories never existed, the discovery of a single ambiguous poem can feel revolutionary. Isn't it strange that absence itself becomes a kind of presence, forcing you to ask why the silence was so carefully maintained? You picture yourself walking back through the old palace gates one last time. The Confucian scholars are gone, the ministers silent, the kings buried. Yet in the air you still sense the rhythm of unrecorded live soldiers who sang together kisaeng, who leaned close under candlelight scholars, who exchanged verses heavy with double meaning. You cannot say for certain what they felt, but you can feel the outlines of what was possible. So when people today debate identity and tradition, perhaps they are also debating memory. What do we choose to remember? What do we choose to forget? And what refuses to stay buried? Were Joseon's hidden loves erased completely? Or are they still here, echoing in every question we ask? Behind the painted screens of Joseon, Korea, history was never as rigid as the Confucian scholars wanted us to believe. Whispers of hidden desires between kings and attendants, scholars and friends, soldiers in the barracks, or kiseng among themselves, surface only in fragments of poetry, rumors, and folklore. Nothing is certain, but the silences themselves suggest possibilities too strong to ignore. And yet living in Joseon was not only about secrets of the heart. Daily survival demanded strict obedience, back-breaking labor, and constant vigilance. Which brings us to the next question. Why wouldn't you last even a single day in Joseon, Korea? You don't wake up in Joseon. Joseon wakes you up. A bronze bell booms from the city pavilion before the sky even thinks of turning blue, and the sound rolls through the rafters like a heartbeat you can't shut off. You jerk upright on the floor mattress and realize the first decision of your day has already been made somewhere else. Time is public here. When the bell speaks, city gates stir gatekeepers' shoulder bars, and everybody's morning belongs to the schedule. Cold air nips at your ankles. Last night's Untold warmth has sunk back into the stone flues, so the floor answers your calves with a crisp bite, and your breath makes small ghosts in the dim room. A rooster complains beyond the courtyard wall. From the alley, the night watchman's wooden clappers knock a tidy pattern that measured the hours and warned away trouble while you slept. You're not hearing a phone. You're hearing a city talk to itself out loud, because clocks are a civic choir and you are one more listener. You slide open the paper door and it replies with a soft sigh. In the courtyard, dark jars of soy paste and kimchi sit like low guardians, their lids beaded with dew. You tuck your arms into a white cotton jacket, because bright color before daylight is a privilege, not a right. Over the wall, a temple drum answers the bell with a low thunder that lingers and fades. You try to tell the time, but here the day is counted differently by earthly branches, by the feel of frost on tile, by the chorus of chores waking in every courtyard around you. A sleepy servant coaxes the kitchen fire back to life with calm hands. He does not say your name, and you do not say his. Names ride on rank, and rank rides on ritual. Even your yawn learns manners. Joseon doesn't greet dawn with chatter. It checks posture. You kneel to fold your bedding and discover your thighs have opinions. The floor demands a squat you only meet at the gym, and your knees negotiate every inch while you smooth the quilt until not a wrinkle looks rebellious. Loose bedding reads like loose character, and character is everyone's business. Outside the eaves, the bell's last tremors hang like mist. In the Capitol bars lift from the great gates at first light, and somebody writes it down, because records are a national hobby. None of this is improvisation. Offices exist for the bell and for the patrols, and somewhere a clerk will notice who failed to hear which signal. The habits that nudge you from sleep have been hammered by statutes with long titles and longer expectations. You, meanwhile, are still trying to remember which pair of straw shoes is yours and which belong to your host. You dip a gourd into the crock and splash your face. The water is a blunt teacher, and your skin wakes up in a hurry. A boy trots past with a tray of charcoal feet, whispering on packed earthhead, lowered by habit rather than fear. He takes you in with a glance, the hair, the sleeves, the stance that says the ground might owe you something, and slips through a side gate that closes with no theatrics. Nobody announces their hustle. The city assumes you can read its cues, and the only signboard you'll get is the sound of other people beginning. If you stand still and listen, you can map neighborhoods by sound. Pestles begin to pound rice into cakes. Someone shakes dust from a mat. A peddler warms the first syllable of a cry he will sing until dusk. Over everything lies a soft rule-sacred order before private comfort. Even in households that never quote a line of philosophy, the morning is a tiny exam in respect who rises first, who tends the fire, who speaks with restraint. Be honest, do you pass that exam before breakfast? Or are you still negotiating with sleep while others have already finished the first chore? The long pavilion street will soon fill. But right now, the alleys belong to caretakers who have learned to be weatherproof. A woman swings open her lattice window, reads the sky like a captain studying currents, then tucks it shut. A scholar in a patched robe clears his throat, as if summoning his ancestors, and shuffles toward the privy with an ink-stained hand that still smells of last night's characters. You wonder what he wrote, by candlelight frost on bamboo, a commentary for the civil exam, a careful petition to a minor office, and you half smile at the idea that paperwork is already awake before the sun. Your own body disagrees with nearly everything. Knees negotiate with the floor. Shoulders negotiate with sleeves wider than your steering wheel back home. You reach to tie a sash and realize it has more opinions than any belt you've met. In a society where silhouettes speak your outline, must say humility at dawn. The smallest mistake, a sash too high, a top not too messy, reads like a paragraph you did not mean to publish. Hair is law. Hats are law. Neither forgives a newcomer who reaches for convenience over correct form. And every neighbor is fluent in these visual sentences. There is, however, pleasure folded inside the rigor. The pot lid lifts, and a ribbon of steam writes a warm line across your face. Pine smoke paints the air with a smell older than your last 3 apartments. Thin light steps over the wall and lingers. You notice that walls here aren't enemies. They are instruments that tune space, turning weather into rooms. A gray cat patrols the wall top like a minor magistrate inspecting boundaries. Somewhere faint but certain, a musician warms a bamboo flute, and the first note threads the air like a ribbon. You feel the pull to step outside and wander, but that is another negotiation. Travel is not a mood. It is a permission. Even inside the capital, your feet are free only because everyone quietly agrees where feet may go. 2 officials pass your gate with a roll of documents tucked in a sleeve. Voices, low steps, synchronized as if the ground itself keeps time. They do not hurry. Precision is paid better than speed. You look down at your hands, think about how many alarms you usually need, and admit that here morning arrives whether you feel ready or not. The bedding is folded, your breath has stopped fogging, and the courtyard smells of pine smoke and damp clay. You rub your eyes hoping for coffee, but Joseon has a different recipe for alertness ritual. Before you earn breakfast, you must earn respect, and respect is not casual here. Every relationship is a staircase, and each step requires a bow, a phrase, a pause long enough to show you understand where you stand. The head of the household emerges first, and you freeze mid-stretch. His robe hangs neat, his top knot precise, his eyes sharp, with a mix of authority and routine. You bend not too low, not too fast, and you utter the greeting drilled into common life peace this morning. The bow isn't optional. It is oxygen. Imagine trying to start your day. Without unlocking your phone here, the key is your posture. And without it, nothing else opens. Then come the layers. Wife, elder son, younger son, cousin, visiting from another province. Each demands a different angle, a different honorific. Your head bobs like a reed in the wind, while your tongue trips over syllables meant to place you properly. It feels like a living version of one of those logic puzzles. If the cousin is older than you, but younger than the host, and the son is studying for the civil exam, but hasn't passed yet, what combination of bows saves your reputation? One mistake, and you're branded rude before the porridge even arrives. A servant glides by with trays, eyes politely lowered, and you realize you owe him acknowledgement too, but not the same one. Servants receive a nod, not a bow, unless they are old enough to count as elders. You pause mid-motion, wonder if you're about to insult or over-elevate and settle for an awkward half gesture that earns you a blink of confusion. The hierarchy is precise, and you are trying to play hopscotch on a board painted by Confucius himself. Breakfast is near, you think, but the rituals continue. Ancestral tablets in the household shrine deserve their own greeting. You watch the family line up, bow thrice, then whisper a formula that knots the past to the present. You mimic the motions, your knees popping audibly, while the younger cousin stifles a laugh at your clumsy dip. Respect extends to the dead as firmly as to the living. You wonder, do you even know the right words to honor your own great-grandparents? At last, bowls appear. Steam rises from plain rice porridge, a dab of kimchi on the side, and your stomach sighs in relief. But the chopsticks are not just tools, they are tight ropes. You must not stick them upright in the bowl that's for funerals. You must not tap them on the rim. That insults the cook, and you must not use them to gesture that insults everyone. You grip them like loaded wands, terrified of pointing the wrong way. Suddenly, breakfast feels less like eating and more like diffusing a bomb. The eldest son clears his throat and begins polite conversation. Not about weather, not about last night's dream. He quotes a passage from the Analects and expects a reply. Your mind races. Should you nod solemnly? Should you add a comment? Or should you just chew slowly and look thoughtful? Silence, too, is a statement. And in Joseon, silence can speak louder than chatter. You sip the thin broth, hoping wisdom hides in the steam. As bowls empty, you think the ordeal is over. But one more test waits the order of rising. No one stands until the head of the household lifts his sleeve and signals it. You twitch, tempted to bolt toward the gate, but catch yourself. Rising early brands, you impatient. Rising late brands, you sluggish. The timing must be exact, like standing for an anthem. So you hover, halfway between crouch and spring, until the master finally rises. Relief floods you, but your thighs are already plotting revenge. Imagine your usual morning, grabbing a snack, while half awake, scrolling through headlines, maybe mumbling hello to a roommate. In Joseon, your first hour is a gauntlet of precision, where even the tilt of a spoon and the arc of a bow sketch your place in the human map. You start to realize that fatigue isn't just from rising early. It's from the sheer labor of belonging. And belonging here is non-negotiable. Your stomach has just survived porridge diplomacy, but now your hair becomes the battlefield. In Joseon, your head is not a private garden, it is a public proclamation. A man without a top knot is a man without standing, and a woman without a proper bun is whispering scandal before she opens her mouth. The government cared so deeply about hair that entire laws were written to punish anyone who cut it without permission. Imagine living in a place where your morning haircut counted as a political act. You touch your scalp and realize the rules start early. Boys grew their hair long until a coming-of-age ceremony bound it up into a sangtu top knot, the official ticket to adulthood. Without it, you were still a child, in the eyes of society, no matter your muscles or ambitions. And cutting the knot was more than a bad style. It was humiliation, a punishment, a mark of rebellion. Think about how you complain when your barber trims half a centimeter too much. Now imagine officials debating whether you even deserve the knot at all. Women's hair bore equal weight. Long locks were twisted into chignons, secured with biniou pins of jade silver or plain wood depending on rank. A noble woman's biniou could gleam like treasure. A peasant's might be no more than polished bamboo, but both screamed identity louder than any ID card. The pin wasn't decoration, it was declaration. If you broke or lost it, you didn't just misplace an accessory. You misplaced your social skin. Would you survive the anxiety of your hairstyle telling strangers everything about you? And then came hats. The GAT, those wide-brimmed, translucent horsehair hats, weren't fashion statements, they were passports. Step into the street bareheaded and suspicion followed. The hat told others your marital status, your scholarly achievement, even your moral character. Fail to wear the right one, and you risked fines, gossip, or worse. Imagine needing a specific hat to prove you're allowed to walk downtown, and the police stop you not for speed, but for brim width. Even officials fought over hats. The Zhongjagwan headgear marked exam success, while military men wore helmets that doubled as social armor. Scholars, meanwhile, cherished their square headdresses, little billboards of Confucian loyalty. You picture a modern graduation cap and gown, but in Joseon, you wore such symbols every day. Your scalp, in other words, never took a holiday. And when disaster struck, floods, famine, invasion hair still mattered. Ming envoys visiting the court once mocked Joseon's strictness, baffled that starving villagers could still be punished for loose or messy knots. Yet to local rulers, discipline of the head equaled discipline of the heart. Could you endure such scrutiny when a stray lock might read as laziness? You try tying your hair with trembling fingers, but the knot slips, the sash loosens, and the imagined gaze of every elder in the neighborhood sears your back. A passing scholar frowns as if your scalp has insulted the classics themselves. He adjusts his own gat with such dignity, you wonder if he practiced in a mirror for years. The air feels heavier when style is surveillance, and you suddenly miss the freedom of baseball caps and messy buns. There is also shame as punishment. Criminals sometimes had their hair shorn as a mark of disgrace. Stripped of knot or bun, they carried dishonor as plainly as a brand. Think of it a haircut that follows you through every alley, every marketplace, louder than any accusation. Would you survive knowing your scalp shouted your crimes before you spoke a word? And so in Joseon, grooming isn't private, it's politics. Each strand obeys hierarchy. Each accessory whispers loyalty. Each brim measures virtue. You glance in the polished brass mirror, see the crooked knot, and realize your hair has already betrayed you. Your hair is finely tied, your hat perched like a reluctant crown, and you think you've conquered the morning. But then the real test begins: the climate and the clothes that bind you to it. Let's be blunt. Joseon doesn't care if you're comfortable. It cares if you are proper. And propriety means white clothes season after season until you begin to wonder if laundry is the true national sport. White linen or hemp isn't optional. From noble to peasant, everyone dresses in shades of pale, a symbol of modesty and Confucian restraint. Imagine a city street where nearly every figure moves like a ghost in cotton fog. At first, it looks poetic, but then you trip over the practical question: how do you keep white clothes clean in a world of mud roads, wood smoke, and fish markets? The answer is, you don't. You scrub endlessly, and the stains judge you as much as your neighbors do. The seasons compound the challenge. In winter, padded cotton robes stiffen into heavy armor, and you shuffle through icy courtyards, weighed down like a snowman. The famous ondol heating beneath the floor offers brief reprieve, but step outside and the cold grips harder than any scarf can fight. Summer reverses the punishment. Hemp robes cling damply to skin, while monsoon air wraps you in wet wool invisibility. You sweat not just from heat, but from the panic of keeping your white robe from looking yellowed. There's a saying that Joseon people wore white not because they loved purity, but because dye was taxed and complicated. Either way, the effect became cultural law. Foreign visitors from China and Japan marveled and sometimes mocked how uniform the palette looked. To them, the capital was a city of mourners. To Joseon, it was a city of virtue. But where do you stand? Would you survive daily life with nothing but a monochrome wardrobe? Now picture yourself sitting on the heated floor, cross-legged in a robe that tangles your knees, while smoke from the kitchen chimney seeps sideways through the flues. The ondol warms stones. The stones warm your floor, and the smoke finds its way out sometimes. More often, it lingers, giving every home the scent of a campfire. Cozy, yes, until your eyes water, and your sleeves trap the haze like incense. Do you think you'd complain? Or would you call it the price of survival? Scholars wrote poems about these contrasts. One complained of ink freezing in winter. Another mocked how his robe soaked so thoroughly in summer rain that even frogs pitied him. Ordinary people turned the ordeal into resilience. Children slept pressed together on floors that steamed faintly from hot stones. Women dried laundry under clear skies, hoping the sun would bleach their whites to a shade acceptable enough for market day. And all the while, smoke stains on walls whispered of the cost of warmth. Luxury often meant enduring the cold with more dignity, not less discomfort. Yangban aristocrats sometimes wore thinner robes indoors, expecting servants to keep fires fed all night. Their suffering wasn't lessened. It was outsourced. The poor, by contrast, bundled layers of hemp until they looked like walking bundles of quilts, bearing the same cold but with more honesty. In Joseon, survival wasn't about blankets, it was about appearances. Imagine your modern life: thermostats, fleece jackets, air conditioning at the tap of a button. In Joseon, the only dial you turn is whether to burn more wood. And wood is not endless. Forests near the capital were stripped bare, in cycles forcing households to ration fuel, to argue with neighbors over rights to gather brush, to weigh warmth against cooking rice. Do you think you'd sleep well, knowing your comfort stole heat from another family's pot? And yet step outside into a frosty morning and watch the white-robed crowd drift toward the market steam, rising from mouth sleeves, swinging in rhythm. There's beauty in the uniformity, a shared endurance that turns discomfort into identity. You tug your own robe tighter, feel the smoke in your lungs, the damp in your collar, and realize in Joseon the weather never stops testing you. You slide back toward the kitchen robe, whispering across the ondol-warm floor, and the same steam that fogged your morning now announces the next trial. The table is not a place to fill your stomach. It's a stage where your hands and face perform character. A low soban tray waits for you, like a small island set adrift on etiquette. On it, rice porridge breathing little clouds, a neat fan of Jim seaweed, a saucer of yang sauce, and a disciplined crescent of kimchi that looks harmless until you remember your chopsticks are legally a pair of opinions. Korea gives you two tools, the jupgarak chopsticks and the sutgarak spoon. Here's the simple rule that isn't simple when everyone watches spoon for rice and soup chopsticks for banchan. Do not lift the rice bowl to your lips like you might in another country. It remains politely grounded. If you rest utensils, they lie parallel at the right edge. They do not straddle the bowl like a pair of sleepy oars. And under no circumstance do your chopsticks stand upright in rice unless you intended to summon a funeral. Your fingers suddenly feel like they're auditioning for a surgery residency. Banchan side dishes multiply like arguments. There's radish kimchi, Maybe dongchimi brine that gleams like winter glass, a small mound of salted fernbrake, a sliver of dried pollock teased into floss. Each one is shared, and each one tests whether you understand invisible fences. You do not spear, you pinch. You do not hover indecisively over the dish like a hawk. You reach, take, and retreat with the quiet confidence of someone who knows exactly how much is respectable. Would you pass that test at an office buffet, or would your chopsticks betray your favorite piece every time timing is a second battlefield? Elders begin first, always. Your spoon waits until the host's spoon moves, and then you pace yourself as if synchronized to his breath. Too fast reads greedy, too slow reads showy. You practice the middle path, tasting softly while the porridge warms your chest with a patient heat. The head of household pauses. You pause. He clears his throat. Your spoon hovers. It feels like eating with a conductor off stage. And once you notice the rhythm, you can't unhear it. If you're looking for the source code behind all this, it sits in books Joseon swore by. Jushi's family rituals. Jujagari didn't just dictate weddings and funerals. Its spirit seeped into dining speech posture. Togia Yi Huang wrote of Li ritual propriety, shaping the heart the way water shapes stone. The table becomes a school, where you practice hierarchy one bite at a time. How's your report card so far passing, or quietly repeating the grade, real people left receipts for these moments? In the 17th century, Zhang Yehyang compiled Yumsik Dimibang, a cookbook that reads like a lab manual for boiling, salting, pickling with discipline. Centuries later, Yibing Heogak's Gyuhap Chongseo folded household management and food into the same universe of order. Neither author screams rules, yet every page assumes you won't fling chopsticks like drumsticks or let brine slide across the tray. When women like these wrote, they measured virtue in teaspoons and temper in the way you ladle broth without splashing your neighbor. Kimchi is the loudest whisper on your tray. Not one kimchi, but a landscape-backed kimchi pail and perfumed yolmu kimchi with summer roots that crunch like thin ice mock. Kimchi red is a sealed promise and salted shrimp paste that smells honest about where it came from. Fermentation lives in those dark jars you noticed at dawn. Now you taste the months those jars have been breathing. You don't slurp the brine like victory. You dab, you nod. You let the salt remind you that winter exists and that people learn to bottle bravery for it. Posture joins the cast. You don't sprawl. Knees fold to one side or tucked beneath hands move from belly to tray and back with a quiet economy. If a sleeve threatens the soup, you corral it with the opposite hand. There's no napkin fanfare, no mouth-wide yawns, no idle tapping chopsticks. Says you are a beggar calling food, and you are not that here. Your utensils rest when they rest like soldiers, at ease, aligned clean ready. You breathe through your nose, smile with your eyes, and pretend chewing, silently, is as easy as breathing. Then there's talk, which arrives disguised as courtesy. The eldest remarks that the kimchi brine has aged well, and the compliment is a bridge you are expected to cross. Do you agree with one respectful sentence, or add a second that risks sounding clever? You choose the single sentence soft and round as a rice spoonful, because at this table the number of words can weigh as much as the number of bites. If someone pours you tea or a sip of macchioli at a feast, 2 hands receive, and if an elder drinks, you turn your face slightly aside to honor age. Your own habits learn humility in the span of a swallow. Street food tempts you too. But even a market bowl of soup is a small exam. You don't blast across the surface with hurricane breaths. You sip from the spoon. You keep conversation. To a murmur you pay with coppers, without shaking the bowl like a rattle. In a world without napkins on every table, you rely on restraint more than fabric. A vendor's eyes are friendly but exact. They can tell who grew up under ritual and who learned from pamphlets. Which one are you? Tonight, back at the Soban, the choreography keeps going. Set the spoon down parallel, not splayed. Return chopsticks to their rest without clack. Resist rearranging the dishes into your favorite geometry. Do not cough into the steam as if baptizing the entire tray. Finishing every grain is gratitude, but racing to empty bowls feels like a challenge to the host's generosity, and asking for more requires a delicate pause that invites the offer rather than demands it. Your mouth begins to form thanks, and you catch the problem before the sound arrives. The word you choose, the honorific, you attach the order of the title, and the name will either polish the meal you were given or scratch it where everyone can see. You've mastered the spoon's choreography just long enough to forget the next trap your mouth. In Joseon, language is a ladder, and every rung is a verb ending that can lift you up or tip you into a social ditch. You clear your throat to say thank you, then freeze, because there isn't one thank you. There is the version for elders, the version for peers, the version for strangers you would like to honor, and the version for people below you whom you still need to treat with dignity. You grip the air with both hands, as if tone itself might be something you can hold steady. Speech here has levels, not vibes. The deferential form rolls like a bow, built out of syllables. The polite form sits upright, with its shoes lined up. The intimate form sprawls on the floor, like cousins after chores. And the blunt form is the sound of parents disciplining a child who has knocked over the water jar. You hear them all in a single alley, a grandmother calling a grandchild inside in the soft register that hems love in silk. A clerk greeting an official with a sentence so carefully buttoned you can hear the starch. Two market women sparring with friendly jabs. You should not copy unless you have earned the right to be that free. Names, meanwhile, are cliffs you are not ready to climb. You don't call elders by given names unless you've decided to set your reputation on fire. You use titles seonseng for a learned manbuin, for a married lady agsi, for the unmarried nari, for a gentleman of rank dagum, for a major official who can ruin your month with a signature. Among scholars, courtesy names and pen names, togi yulgok, float like sail flags. To use them well is to know the wind. A wrong title is not cute. It is a small social accident that keeps happening until someone mercifully stops talking to you. The head of household asks a question, and it lands in your lap like an exam slip. He's testing whether you understand distance. Do you answer with the deferential register that cushions each verb as if lowering a porcelain bowl, or with the middling form that keeps respect but leaves room to breathe? You pick deferential overdo it and accidentally sound like you're addressing a royal secretary. He blinks amused. The aunt hides a smile in her sleeve. The servant's eyes brighten, because respect that spills is still respect. Your cheeks begin to understand that in Joseon, blushes are punctuation. There are laws behind these manners. The Gyeongguk Daejeon State Law Code doesn't print a phrase chart for you, but it defends the hierarchy that makes speech levels more than style. Slander is a punishable offense. Insults to parents and elders can bring penalties that sting your pride and, if you're unlucky, your skin. Village compacts the hyangyak that thinkers like Yi Huang and Yi I loved teach neighbors to correct each other gently, or not when mouths run faster than minds. Imagine your group chat's etiquette turning into a signed neighborhood pact with witnesses, and you'll feel weight. At the market, your tongue keeps stepping on rakes. A fishmonger calls you Nari with a sly curve to his tone because your sleeves and hat say, pretend noble, and you must answer with the right mix of humility and clarity. Too lofty, and you're a parody. Too casual, and you insult a man who knows the tides better than you know your own stride. You buy a slice of pollock, offer coins with both hands, and say a cheerful thanks, in a form that accidentally sounds intimate enough to be family. He laughs not unkindly, and answers in the polite register that pulls you back to the correct distance. The palace has its own dialects of deference. Court ladies speak in phrases that feel like stepping across polished ice. Eunuchs Nisi carry messages with words that fold into one another neatly so nothing spills. And Amhyang Eoza, a secret inspector, could ride into a town and learn more from verbs than from ledgers. How people bow in grammar tells him who fears whom, who pretends, and who is tired of pretending. Would your sentences betray you if an inspector listened from behind a screen? You pass a group of scholars arguing about a character from Mencius, and the sound is oddly soothing. Honorifics rising and falling, like kites in a steady wind. The occasional plain form snapping like a kite string that someone quickly ties back with a smile. A name is not even said. A title does the work. A pen name floats by like a respectful cloud. Later, a mother scolds her son with words that are soft in grammar, but firm in rhythm, and you realize affection can be wrapped in deference so that love does not excuse laziness. Even in private, you don't relax your tongue completely. Gossip, if it turns into written complaint, can become a case file. A careless joke about an official, especially one within earshot, might become an afternoon at the magistrate's explaining why your wit needed to kick upward. Punishments exist. You have heard the thud of bamboo before, and you do not need another lesson in how law feels. You practice safer habits more, perhaps more. It is said more. I wonder if not only because caution is wise, but because Joseon prefers humility to swagger in every sentence. You try to learn kinship terms that function as social glue. Older brother Hyungnim soothes a boisterous mood among men. Older sister Ioni turns a sharp corner soft among women. These are not props. They are invitations to behave. If you call someone older brother, you owe him a little patience. If someone calls you teacher, seon saying, your next sentence had better stand up straight. Titles hug on posture from the inside. They make you rehearse the respect you owe until the respect becomes muscle memory. You experiment with compressing your thoughts into deferential packets. A request starts with an apology for asking. A refusal tucks itself behind a calendar or a prior promise. An opinion arrives not as a trumpet, but as a flute from another room. This does not mean people here never shout. Protest exists murmured, and sometimes loud, but even loudness wears clothes. A wrong verb ending can hollow out a good idea. A right ending can carry it through a courtyard full of skeptics. Now and then, you catch yourself in a modern habit, joking too quickly, cutting a story short, mixing intimacy into distance, and watch the air change temperature around the table. You fix it, mid-sentence back the card up, add the honorific like a missing hinge, and the room warms again. Language feels less like a dictionary and more like the household's heating system, invisible when it works, all anyone notices when it doesn't. By late morning, your jaw aches from politeness you didn't know had muscles. Your ears ring with registers you tried to stack in order, and your tongue sits quietly in your mouth, the way a fresh recruit sits on a bench, listening before speaking. You look at the gate. Think about stepping into the street where titles and registers multiply, and you straighten your hat, not because it protects you from weather, but because it signals to the world that your grammar will try to behave. Stop. This is the part that snaps your modern brain. And Joseon choice isn't a button you press. It's a costume you're born wearing, stitched with titles you didn't pick. You're not you, the way you think. You're someone's junior, or senior insider, or base-born, permitted, or prohibited, and the script is older than your opinions. One courtyard glance can read your place faster than any ID check, and before lunch, the hierarchy has rearranged the air you breathe. The board is laid out in sturdy pieces. Yangban at the top, 2 streams, civil Munban and military Muban. The specialized middle people, Jungin. Then the bulk of society, Sangmin, the commoners who carry fields and cities on their backs. And under them, the stigmatized Shionmin and the bondservant class called Nobi. Your birth certificate here isn't a document. It's a menu of rights and obligations. Which one did you order, without meaning to Yangban live on reputation that doubles as legal insulation? Their names sit inside family genealogies, Jokbo, like polished beads, proof that the line has been respectable for generations. They read, teach, govern, and quote the classics with a smoothness that makes their sleeves look smarter than your college essay. The official path in is the civil service exam, the Guagio, where brush tips duel over Confucian commentaries. Pass it, and your hat brim widens. Your deference receives deference, and doors open, because the state prefers men who can argue the spring and autumn annals without spilling tea. Fail it repeatedly, as many did, and your household becomes a clock wound, tight with muttered couplets and silent dinners. Even inside Yangban, there's an edge between the bookish Munban and the sword-bearing Muban. The civil men quote rights. The military men test spear drills at dawn and guard the capital gates. A general might command forts and garrisons, but a polished civil official can still outrank him in rooms where ink speaks louder than iron. You nod respectfully to both, because either can reroute your afternoon with a frown. Jungin, the middle people, are specialists that Joseon can't live without, but won't let dine at the top table. Interpreters from the Bureau of Interpreters trade in Chinese, Japanese, Mongolian, the way money changers trade coins. Astronomers at the Royal Astronomical Bureau read the heavens to set calendars. Court physicians examine pulses through silk cords. Legal clerks and accountants keep the ledgers that keep the palace breathing. They inherit posts more often than they win them, and their pride is craft, not lineage. If you want a passport of competence, you shake a Jungin hand. If you want a key to prestige, you borrow a Yangban surname. Which one would you call when your roof collapses status or skill? Sangmin, the commoners, are the muscle and marrow of the country farmers, artisans, fisherfolk, and merchants. They pay the grain that becomes stipends, the cloth that becomes military cloth, tax the labor days that repair roads and storehouses. When reformers later pushed the Daedong law to swap tangled tribute lists for standardized grain levies, it's the Sangmin whose carts creak under the new order. A good harvest feeds officials as surely as families. A bad one feeds petitions, then punishments. The state wants rice in the storehouses, men. on the rosters and roofs intact. Your private plans rank after that. Below them, the Qianmin, the base people, carry social shadows for trades the elites like to use, but not to praise butchers and tanners who keep towns fed and shod entertainers who sing histories and dance satire grave diggers who make sure the dead rest shamans who negotiate with what everyone pretends not to fear. They register on lists that follow them like long winters. Marriage up the ladder snaps like a bowstring under too much pull. You nod to the butcher behind his stall and feel the oddness of a society that needs his knife, but won't sit his family near its ink-stained sons at festivals. Then there are the nobi, the bondservants, whose status makes foreign visitors reach for the wrong word. They are not exactly chattel slaves, not exactly free laborers. They exist in a gray space the law understands too well. Public nobi, gong nobi, serve state offices. Private nobi, often called sanoe, serve households. Some live out farming plots and sending quota grain or cloth to a master. Some live in cooking cleaning, carrying messages. They can marry, hold small property, sometimes buy freedom. They can also be sold, inherited, punished. Their children usually inherit the status. To a modern ear, this sounds like the past refusing to let go. And that's exactly how it feels when you watch a woman in clean white carry a tray to a room she'll never dine in. What does this hierarchy feel like hour by hour? You step into a lane, and a mounted gentleman expects the right of way without a word. Sumptuary rules decide fabrics, sleeve widths, hair ornaments, even the carved patterns allowed on a walking stick. You don't shout across the market to a yangban the way you might wave down a barista. You wait for a glance, then a nod. Then you try not to use too many verbs. A Jungian interpreter passes in a crisp jacket stained by ink. You make space because he holds the border in his mouth. A Sangmin fisherman hauls nets that smell like the tide's handwriting. You make space because his morning will become your dinner. The law tilts with the ranks. A riotous quarrel between two commoners becomes a case file. The same quarrel with a yangban can turn into a lecture, a fine or a quiet favor that dissolves like mist. That doesn't mean elites always win. Secret inspectors, the Amhyangyosa, drop into counties unannounced with warrants tucked into sleeves, and one famous inspector, Park Munsu, under King Yongjo, made careers tremble by listening to alleys as much as to magistrates. But you can feel how the default runs downhill. Do you rely on a surprise night to ride through your town? Or do you learn to bow with the grain of the wood? The great names you've heard wear this order like weather. Admiral Yi Sun-sin keeps a diary that bleeds discipline because rank can't save him from political enemies. Dasan Zhong-yak-yong drafts ideas for more humane governance while enduring exile because reform reads like insolence if the wrong ear is listening. Toegye Yi Huang and Yulgok Yi. I write ethics that twist through village bylaws so tightly the rules still hum after the ink dries. You side-eye your own century's complaints about office politics and admit this is office politics on stone foundations. Could you jump tiers? In theory, yes. Pass the exams, marry into a good line, perform a service that earns a royal favor. In practice, lineage guards the stairs like a house dog that only recognizes old scents. The exam route demands tutors' time and grain to keep you upright while you memorize. A merchant might buy land and kindness, but still hear whispers at weddings. A nobi might purchase freedom, and discover freedom has its own taxes. In a country shaped like a pyramid vertical movement is a rumor the horizontal world tests with raised eyebrows. So you walk, past white sleeves that say purity and practice, past a butcher stall that smells honest about work, past a magistrate's gate whose shadow says the law is awake, past the interpreter who can explain you to foreigners, but cannot explain himself into a Yangban's genealogy. Rank speaks in every hinge, and you learn to hear it on the street, in the grain store at the riverbank, where fishermen argue prices without ever crossing an invisible line. The map isn't printed. It's performed one bow, one brim, one ledger line at a time. You step toward the gate like a person who owns his feet, and the city gently reminds you that feet are licensed. Out there, distance is measured in stamps, and movement is a verb the state conjugates. Breakfast demanded manners. Streets demand papers. You pat your sash the way you'd pat a pocket for a wallet, and you feel nothing. Because the thing you need isn't money. It's permission folded and inked with a seal fat and red enough to calm a gatekeeper's eyebrows. Start with the book. You didn't write the household register hojak, the magistrate's clerk's hyangni, with ink under their nails, and memories like fishing nets, record births, deaths, marriages, divorces, adoptions, relocations, status. Your name there isn't poetry, it's plumbing. It connects your body to taxes, corvée days, military rosters, and court jurisdiction. If you vanish from the page, you also vanish from protection. Floating person sounds romantic until a patrol decides you're a tax dodger or a runaway nobi and escorts you somewhere you didn't plan to tour. You imagine the registry office, a cool room paper stacked like winter firewood brushes, resting like birds on a branch. A clerk asks your lineage, the village name, your legal status, Yangan commoner, Yungen, specialist Yangban. If your genealogy can swagger Cheonmin, if fate dealt you a low-card nobi, if a master's name rides on your back. He writes with the certainty of someone who knows that one crooked stroke can turn a life into a case. You stand straighter because posture feels like a supporting document. Now the pass, a day trip to the next market town. You don't just go. You visit the county office for a travel letter, plain paper if your errand is ordinary, more elaborate if it smells of government. The form says who you are, where you sleep, where you're headed, for what purpose, how long, and who will scold you if you don't come back on time. It earns the magistrate's seal, red round, soft at the edges like a fruit. And suddenly, your walk becomes a line that can be traced by anyone with a lamp and authority. Papers exist because people do, of course, try to slip the nets. Soldiers dodge rosters. Corvée shirkers dodge shovels. Bond servants nobi run for lives that feel more like lives if the page can't find them. So the state grows. Eyes gate guards at city walls who ask at dawn, and at curfew inspectors, at post stations, yaks spaced along official roads, like beads, checkpoint sheds and mountain passes that smell of pine and boredom. Present your paper, receive a brush mark or a little chop. Walk on with the echo of your identity updated by strangers. Sometimes the paper hangs from your belt. Early in the dynasty, under King Taeyong, the court rolled out Hopai ID tags of wood or bone. They listed your name, age, status, residence, and employer if you were bound. Officials imagined a cleaner map. One tag per body, fewer ghosts between the lines. Enforcement came and went over the centuries, but the idea stuck like a burr. Your right to move is a thing you wear, and a guard's hand can test it like a coin. You tug your sash and picture the tag knocking against your hip each time you breathe. The city itself collaborates. Gates publish time with bells, but they also publish permission. Curfew closes the hinges. Papers explain why you ignore the hint. Night walking without a reason is like whistling in a library. People look up. Patrols, watchmen, with clappers, ask questions in tones that make you feel like your answers should already be on file. If you've ever fumbled for a subway card, while a turnstile beeps impatiently, you know that brief flush of shame. Here multiply it by rank, by law, by the silence of neighbors learning your name for the first time because someone says it loudly in the dark. Even short errands have many bureaucracies. Want to move households? The register must ripple out of this village into that ward notice, to both magistrates, notation of why marriage, famine, debt, adoption service. The paper travels while you pack. A month later, a clerk you've never met can tell you where you legally sleep, even if last night you slept nowhere. And this is both comfort and cage depending on where you stand when he says it. Merchants learn to carry entire biographies in sleeves. Rice brokers, Gate stack authorization notes alongside tally slips their livelihood a thicket of seals that convince local granaries to open mouths. Itinerant peddlers, medicine sellers with boxes like tiny apothecaries, tinkers who retin your kettle, wear legitimacy the way others wear jackets, and when a guard stops them, they smile with the dry patience of people who have rehearsed their route in nouns and stamps. You watch the exchange, 2 hands, 1 letter a nod, the little sound of a brush making a new mark and the road unclenches. And then the exceptions, the people who move because the state tells them to. Messengers on post horses' sleeves snapping, inspectors with warrants tucked like knives, tribute carriers crawling under loads of paper the court will turn into decisions. Their papers outrank your papers. If a relay captain needs your rented horse, your pass becomes a polite suggestion, and the horse becomes royal for the afternoon. You learn the wisdom of traveling with humility and a face that says, I will not slow this road down. The police office, Podachong, in the capital, keeps its own lattice of knowledge lists of suspected thieves' notes on alley feuds that sometimes turn into night stabbings, rumors about a noble house that lost 2 servants who probably found the countryside more democratic. When festivals swell, the streets, extra patrols walk with a rhythm that says they expect to read more names tonight. Even temple fairs have informality braided with order vendors who pay for the right to set up storytellers who have a square assigned beggars confined to edges where alms don't embarrass officials. You decide to test your luck and aim for the post station beyond the south gate. At the wall, a guard scans your robe, your hat, your hands, the way a seasoned clerk scans a ledger for missing columns. You offer the letter. He reads your village, your destination, the length of your errand, and asks a question you didn't expect. Why today? You answer too brightly. He watches your smile until it stops trying so hard, then softens. His brush whispers. Your paper receives a date stamp that isn't a stamp, and the gate allows your body to become a future someone else can verify. Out on the road, the paper relaxes in your sleeve, but never leaves your mind. A narrow bridge over a paddy becomes a border if a local headman decides that strangers today are suspicious. The inn at the market expects you to register not just your name, but whose cousin vouches for you. The host copies your details with the steady hand of someone who knows an inspector could appear tomorrow and ask why he let a person-shaped question sleep under his rafters. Some of this sounds suffocating until you trip and discover how paper catches you. A pickpocket lifts your coin pouch in the crush outside a shrine. You shout. A watchman blows a whistle. The crowd tenses like a single muscle. Your description moves faster than you do because people here memorize faces the way farmers memorize weather. An hour later, the watchman returns, not with your pouch, but with a question. Are you registered at so-and-so ward? He didn't need your outrage. He needed your line on the map. Without it, you are a story. With it, you are a case. The same web ties Nobi to households. A bondservant who runs has a name on a register, and a master with a ledger that insists on return. Notices travel. Gatekeepers keep half an ear for new faces who fit old descriptions. Sometimes a runaway buys time with forged papers. Sometimes he joins a mountain village that survives on distance. You feel the ache of that calculus freedom measured in miles and stamps, and you understand why some people memorize the posture of belonging better than the grammar of it. There's also the gamble in complaint. If a magistrate cheats, if a tax clerk skims, you could write a petition and chase it up the system with a chain of seals praying it doesn't go missing. The bravest try for a royal ear. There were channels for that. But the line between bold and foolish is a hair wide, and you can feel it standing in your shoes. The paper that protects can also bruise if you wave it in the wrong courtyard. By late afternoon, your sleeve carries the day's story in fibers slightly more creased than morning. You realize how much of walking is translation self into document, into permission, into steps that leave a trace someone else can follow. You hear the wooden clappers beginning their early evening measures, and your feet turn toward the gate before the bell tells them to. The gate lets your body pass, but the road keeps your name. A ledger somewhere just blinked, and now the world expects you to pay for the miles you take with grain days and skin. Work here is not a personal plan. It's a public contract with due dates in 3 columns, harvest quotas, corvée labor, and the kind of justice that teaches your calves how bamboo sounds. Fields first. Rice isn't simply rice, it's arithmetic. Officials don't ask, how tired are you? They ask how many gayal of land you sowed, what the water did to the paddies, how many bundles make a tax-worthy stack. Your good year inflates the government's expectation next year. Your bad year invites suspicion that you hid sheaves under a neighbor's mat. A clerk sets out a wooden measure, taps the rim, with the confidence of a man who has watched the sky for decades, and scoops your sweat into units the state can store without tasting. Taxes used to be an alphabet soup of tribute items: paper thread, mats, fish, sauce, bamboo. The strange specificity of a country that could turn any object into obligation. Reformers pushed the Daidong law equalized tribute, so that instead of a crazy quilt of goods, you owed grain, and later sometimes cotton cloth or coins. It sounds simpler until you remember grain doesn't walk itself to the granary. You lug it by shoulder and by ox-up roads that believe in mud more than mercy, while an official checks your load with the cheerful suspicion of a man whose pay depends on undercounting your effort. Then the military cloth tax gunpo, the fee that says you owe soldiering, but we prefer your fabric. Too many men, not enough coin. So the state took cloth instead. Under King Yongzhou, the Gunyak law trimmed that burden on paper, reducing payments and widening the base with new revenue sources, but numbers on a royal decree only travel as fast as a magistrate's conscience. In your village, the rumor is that 1 became 1, yet somehow the clerk's abacus still clicks twice, and you can't tell whether you're hearing math or appetite. Corvée Yoryak arrives like a subscription box you didn't remember signing up for. The state wants bodies for roads, city walls, river embankments, granary repairs, relay stations. Your turn comes by roster. Your body appears, with tools that weigh like family arguments. You learn to swing a mattock in a rhythm the foreman can count. You learn that a cracked water jar at midday is less tragedy than a good excuse for 2 extra breaths. You learn that inspection day is a performance, and the audience carries brushes, not flowers. Do you fake a cough and pay a neighbor to take your shift? Or do you show up and earn the kind of exhaustion that makes a floor feel like forgiveness? Some labor is hereditary. Government workshops keep craft families on ropes, woven from skill and duty bronze workers who cast bells that tell the city what hour it is, paper makers whose sheets turn into exams, and verdicts, lacquerers who make trays that will carry other people's comfort. As a Gangan artisan, you serve the state with hands that never retire your children, learning the scent of glue and oil before they learn their letters. Pride and trap sit in the same room and refuse to look away. Grain is not just taken. Sometimes it's loaned. The Hwangak grain loan system promises spring rice to be repaid after harvest with a tidy interest. In a fair year, it's a bridge. In a lean year, it's a knot. Local managers discover that interest breeds cousins' fees and necessary costs, and suddenly the loan that kept your children upright has grown antlers. Later reformers, like Dasan Jongyakyong, will write warnings about these barnyard monsters in his Mokmin Simseo, a handbook for magistrates who want to sleep at night, but you live before or beside reform, where the monster still wanders lanes. Coin slides in and out of this world like a visiting uncle. Sangpyeong, Tongbo coppers begin to jingle in sleeves, and markets hum with prices you can count without untying sacks. But taxes still trust grain more than metal. And the price of a mistake at the scale is measured in bruised pride and missing dinners. A Gekju rice broker weighs your sacks with a stone that looks a little too enthusiastic. Your eyes meet and you both pretend the stone didn't just gain a memory. Officials do get watched. Secret inspectors ride out with tempers trained to look friendly while listening hard. Park Munsu, under Yongjo, was famous for turning a casual question into a truth that made a county magistrate sweat through silk. But an inspector is a meteor, not a season. Most days, you live under the weather of familiar faces with familiar ledgers, and you learn the small art of surviving within arm's reach of power without inviting its handshake too often. Punishments hum behind this system like a drum you don't always hear, but you march to anyway. The law code, Gyeongguk Daejeon, with later supplements, lays out the 5 punishments: beating with the light stick, beating with the heavy stick, penal servitude, exile, and death. The light and heavy rods teach your calves what bamboo can argue without drawing blood. Servitude sends you to a government workshop you didn't apply to. Exile ships you to wind-bitten islands or far northern counties where the winter reads like a complaint. Death arrives in forms a narrator won't savor, because this is still bedtime. Torture exists in interrogation rooms, but it's not festival spectacle. It's a cold bench, a rope, a stick, a reminder that truth has a price in a place that also believes in Confucian virtue. Treason drags families because in the logic of loyalty, a tree's roots must have known what the branches were plotting. If that seems cruel to you, it seemed cruel to some then too. And memorials cross desks, asking kings to remember that law without mercy turns subjects into stones that do not answer when called. You notice how punishment touches class. A Yangban's misstep can fall into a lecture and a fine a commoner's into a flogging that teaches him not to shout in the market a nobis into a reminder that the law knows his owner's name before it knows his. And yet fame for fairness exists a magistrate who returns extra grain, who camps on the embankment until it holds, who cancels a corvée day because the rain is trying to drown the rice. People build legends out of afternoons like that. They carry the story from ward to ward the way you carry a talisman in your sleeve. Work never stops at the field's edge. Women run economies that never sign their names, spinning, weaving, fermenting, drying fish, nursing, bargaining hard for a half handful more in the market scale, keeping accounts in the slippery currency of favors and kinship. A wife who stretches winter kimchi to April is a minister of survival. A mother who trades 2 jars of soy for 1 bundle of firewood without giving up dignity is a diplomat whose office happens to have a clay floor and a sleeping child. And markets breathe their own law. Guilds of porters and boatmen have leaders who settle disputes. Market inspectors collect fees and shush fraud. Storytellers keep crowds sweet so prices don't spike with tempers. A fist fight over a rotten fish is less about the fish than about the thin line between hunger and insult. You don't step into those circles unless you know which shoulder touch is apology and which is invitation to swing. Afternoons fold into the kind of tired that makes even your hat feel heavy. And still there's counting to do. How many sheaves are safe from tax? How many days remain on your corvée chart? How many coppers you can spend without stealing from a future you have not met yet? You listen for the clack of a patrol's sticks in the lane, the low murmur of a clerk reading names at the ward office door, the kettle arguing on the brazier for 1 more cup before darkness negotiates the streets. Bang. The bell doesn't ask, it commands. At sunset, the great bronze in the city pavilion roars across rooftops, announcing that the gates are closing and the streets are no longer yours. If the morning bell felt like a nudge, this one feels like a verdict. Curfew is not a suggestion. It is a lock on every alley. The sound is joined by drums and gongs, a rolling percussion that makes even dogs pause mid-bark. You look up at the paling sky and realize the day is finished whether you finished it or not. Patrols fan out with clappers knocking in sharp rhythm. They don't just walk, they measure. Each crack of wood is a ruler against the silence, a reminder that anyone still outside without reason is already suspicious. Torches flare, casting shadows that leap like nervous ghosts against white robes. Shop shutter market cries fold back into homes. Storytellers in taverns cut their tales mid-plot. The city exhales, but it is not relaxation, it is containment. You know that if you keep walking, the patrol's torchlight will eventually land on you, like a question you can't afford to answer. Inside households light oil lamps, their glow soft but precious. Families gather around trays, not for feasting, but for quiet bowls of soup or late rice, and conversation lowers to a murmur that won't leak beyond walls. The curfew teaches you that night belongs to duty, and dreams not wandering. Even festivals bend to this rhythm. Lantern parades finish, early dancers step off stages before the bell. Laughter fades, because laughter outside curfew can be mistaken for defiance. Would you survive a world where even joy has office hours? Nights without papers can be cruel. A doctor rushing to a patient, a messenger carrying urgent news, a midwife summoned by pounding fists, all must carry permits that glow brighter in the dark than any torch. Without them, a watchman's suspicion might escort them straight to the magistrate's bench. You imagine fumbling in your sleeve for a document while a torch hisses near your cheek, and you feel how fragile mobility becomes when the sun sets. Your own feet itch to move, but the city says stillness is virtue. The curfew also builds its own kind of intimacy. Courtyards hum with hushed talk. Children press ears to walls to catch stories of ancestors or monsters. Women mend clothes by lamplight. Men sip weak wine and let philosophy seep into the silence. Scholars reread Confucian texts, brush scratching paper, with characters that try to outlast curfew. Somewhere, a lonely yangban paces rehearsing memorials he will never dare submit. Somewhere else, a nobi hums a folk song so softly it feels like breathing. The city may be sealed, but voices still leak upward, threading the night like thin smoke. And dreams. Dreams are the only travel permitted. You lie on the yo bedding you folded so neatly at dawn, listening to the last embers sigh in the Untold flues, and your body reminds you that a single Joseon day has more choreography than a month in your modern life. Knees ache from bows, tongue from honorifics, shoulders from carrying taxes, scalp from the tyranny of knots and hats. You survived dawn meals, hierarchy, paperwork, fields, punishments, and curfew, and yet you feel less like a survivor and more like a guest who barely passed the audition. The irony is that safety hides inside the restriction. Curfew quiets thieves, gates keep out raiders, patrols discourage fires and brawls. The night is heavy, yes, but it is predictably heavy, and predictability is a form of comfort when famine and invasion always lurk beyond memory. People here might complain of cold floors, heavy robes, endless bows, but they also sleep, knowing order will rise with the morning bell. Could you accept confinement as the price of security? Or would you itch to pry open the gates before dawn? Some figures made the curfew famous. King Sejong ordered bells to mark curfew with precision so that commerce didn't spill into chaos. Later, kings tightened or loosened enforcement depending on fears of rebellion or plague. Secret inspectors recorded curfew violations in reports to the throne, sometimes amused, sometimes alarmed. There were always stories. Lovers caught whispering in back lanes, gamblers scattering like rats when the clappers neared scholars, petitioning to study by lantern at friends' houses and being marched home by patient guards. The law was rigid, but life still slipped around its edges like water around stones. You roll onto your side, watching shadows of rafters crawl across the paper door. And you wonder, could you last another day? Would your knees learn to bow without complaint? Your tongue learn to stack honorifics like bricks? Your patience learn to carry grain taxes without plotting escape? The Joseon world is beautiful in its order and merciless in its demands, elegant in poetry and stubborn in law. You may have survived one sunrise to curfew, but your modern instincts are already rebelling in whispers. And tomorrow, the bell will sound again, earlier than you want, louder than you need, summoning you back into a day you never truly controlled.